one thing we can do to blend this further is to kind of match the grain a bit more and do some extra, more advanced grain techniques. So one way to check your grain and see if it's kind of matching, other than like eyeballing it, we don't have a perfect match because we don't have a great scan of this, and the Regrain's not playing along super well with this footage, but we can still match it pretty close. And one of the things you can do is, so after we've merged this over the background, we can go down here and do a technique to check the grain, which basically you just have to blur your image by 1 pixel and then minus it from the original. And what that does is creates a kind of a frequency separation to see the grain. And what that means is if you put a grade after and you gain up by like 100, so I just put it to 104, we can actually check our grain here and see how close we're matching. So I can, I'm going to increase this a little bit further even. So one of the things that can happen if you're doing heavy despilling, meaning if we have a footage with a lot of contamination of green, is, you know, when we're doing those color corrections on the edges of our footage, essentially you're darkening that area, or you're changing the color, which is technically changing the grain from the original footage. You remember the grain or the sensor noise is, you know, it's the kind of speckling we get if we zoom in here and all that kind of grain pattern. I'm just going to call it grain for simplicity, but either sensor noise or grain, depending if it's film or digital, is there. But if we color correct something, it's changing that grain. You know, for example, the blue channel usually has more grain in it, just due to the way how camera sensors work. But if we take out blue from an area, you know, or we change the color, it's not really changing the pattern of the grain. It's just changing the color. So it's kind of, it's very hard to be super scientific with grain, and, you know, people have different approaches, and there are compositors who basically argue over this. So, you know, what's the best way to handle grain? And, you know, I don't know that there's any best way. Some supervisors and different people prefer different ways, but I'm going to show you guys one way to kind of restore some grain here. So what we actually have a problem is, where we have a problem, if we look on the edges here, we have some dark kind of edges in our grain, we can see. So everywhere we did these like color corrections, we sort of have this like weird darkness. And especially where we darken the plate here to help integrate it to the background, we sort of reduced all the grain in that area because we darkened it. So what that leads to is kind of an image that doesn't have like an overall standard grain. So one possible way of doing it is if you have a better denoiser, meaning this denoise tool. If you have a better one, like Reduce Noise, the company, they create Neat Video. Basically, you could just denoise the whole shot, do all your work as normal, and then you would just put your grain here at the end. And honestly, I personally believe that that's one of the best ways to do it, because the Neat Video plugin is so unbelievably good at denoising without losing detail. Now, there's some people who disagree with me, but you know, I think that's probably one of the best ways, especially considering the new technology with Neat Video. But if you don't want to do it that way, and you don't have as good of a denoiser, we were just using the Nuke default one. We don't have the proprietary plugin. One way to do it is to, I'll show you. So basically, instead of just denoising our key, I'm going to denoise the entire shot. So instead of just that denoise result going into our alpha, I'm going to disable this, and I'm going to put a denoise here. And so that denoise is going to go all the way through our actual picture, which means essentially, you know, we don't have any grain on this picture anymore. And you can lose a little bit of detail that way as well. So if we look and we compare our grain, you see it's all just dark here. So there's still some, because Nuke doesn't get rid of it completely. So what we can do is essentially the process is we remove our grain here, we do our color corrections, and then we re-add the grain from the original video back on. Okay, so I'm going to take the video and the denoise, I'm going to copy it, and after the pre-multiplication, I'm going to make a spot for some grain. And there's a reason we put it after the pre-multiplication. I'm going to explain in just a second here. But what we're going to do is we're going to minus the denoise version from the original version here. So let me put a merge node and put a minus node. So I'm going to say minus. And essentially you want to swap it so you don't have this weird dark edge kind of look. Basically you want it so the original is subtracting the denoised. And that will give us a good basically grain footage. And if you gain up, you can see it. So now we're basically pulling off the grain separately from the original video. And essentially we can just take that result and just plus it onto our comp. So if I switch this to a plus, and you see now if we zoom in here, if we zoom in real close, you see we're adding back the grain. And you want to make sure this is the original plate minus the denoise, because if we have it the opposite, you see when we're adding it, it's not doing the right thing. It's actually softening our footage. It's not adding the grain back. So if you're seeing it get softer, you're probably putting this backwards. You want to say the A as the original footage minus B, which is the denoised. So you see something like that. And the reason we did it after the pre-multiply is, well, you'll see that there's all this grain here, and we don't want to keep the grain where it was over the green screen. But we might need to have some grain in this semi-transparent edge. So if we were to do this before the pre-multiply, I'm going to show you. If we did it this way instead, and then we put the pre-multiply after, you see the grain actually fades off as the footage becomes semi-transparent. So if there's something that's out of focus, it's not going to have like the strength of the grain that you need necessarily, which is kind of a problem, because then you have the problem we had where you have like kind of edges that don't have grain. It's kind of a weird thing, but if you do it after and then you mask this result by the alpha of our input. So we say we want to take the original footage, take the alpha from it, and mask this grain that we're adding back on. Sorry, we'll set it to, yeah, actually that's correct. So A mask B. You see that we get rid of all the green screen area, but then we have the same problem where the grain fades off in the semi-transparent areas. So what you want to do is you want to make the semi-transparent areas kind of solid. So you kind of make a harsh matte. So what you want to do before you mask the grain is you want to make the alpha kind of a chunky, kind of core matte looking alpha. So we switch it to RGBA, and we can put the white clamp so we don't have anything going over 1. And we can boost all the way to the edge so that we're going to get grain going all the way to the very edge. And then we can sort of darken it a little bit so we don't have any weird stuff coming through. And if we look at that now, we see the grain goes all the way. So if I disable it and I enable it, you see the grain is going all the way to the edge. And then we're plussing that over. So now we're getting a little bit, we're kind of graining the edge as well. And if we add that over our final image, you see that now the grain seems to fade into the background. Now, if you zoom in real close and we just to show you guys, if I take the original and I do the wrong way, just to show you why this whole pre-multiply thing matters. So if we were to do it this way, we would say merge A plus B. I'm just going to show you guys the incorrect way so that we can solidify the concept. Okay, so we've added it on, and then we pre-multiply it after, and then we just plug that in. And then we zoom in here. You see how just on the very edge, there's a little bit less grain. If we switch between that and what we just did the other way, it's a very small difference, but if you see, it fades the grain all the way through. And if you compare it and you look at this result, so this is our grain test. If you look up here specifically, you see, look at the edges and all that stuff. And then if we switch it to the wrong way, you see how there's a dark edge that goes all the way around. When we check our grain, we can see this kind of dark halo going around. So if we do it and we switch back, that's kind of fading to the edge. And, you can control that alpha as well. If it's for some reason a little bit too bright, we might need to adjust the grain that's on the background as well. You can obviously adjust that alpha as well. So if it's too much, basically you're just trying to get rid of the dark halo in the grain. And so I'm going to tweak this background grain as well, just to make a little bit less green, it looks like. Because we can see the color of it, it's a little bit different. So if you see like it's kind of greenish and this is slightly more purple, this is why the grain check really helps. You can maybe just reduce our green amount a little bit, so we can just kind of reduce it down and get a grain that sort of flows across a little bit better. And so that's pretty good, and we see our grain is going across the edges, and we have a pretty good result. So that's one way to go about the grain workflow, and it's more of an advanced technique, but that's going to help you guys out in terms of making like a really seamless image, and it really helps blend your edges as well, and your key all together, so it makes it feel like it was really filmed in the same camera. So I'll call this grain workflow. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. We have all our detail in there. I'm just making sure that our little grain trick didn't add any problems. And it seems to have done a pretty good job in this way. So there's many different ways of doing this. And when you get into CG compositing as well, and you have a lot of things that you're adding or removing grain from, which is really important because it makes it feel filmed the same. There are different ways to have more advanced grain workflows to create alphas, so you grain certain areas differently. But this is a pretty good base, and if you guys understand this, you're pretty much further ahead than probably a lot of people in terms of understanding grain. So we can see here that maybe this grain is slightly a little bit weird of a color. So this technique is not 100% in terms of like flawless. So we could probably what this technique is great for though is like you can go in there and like adjust it. So whereas you couldn't adjust the grain before, you could go here and slightly we could do a hue correct and slightly adjust the grain that was over the green screen. So we could go here and we could select this colors and we could say we want to reduce the amount of like blue. So we could actually suppress the blue in the grain. And if we look at it, so we're kind of just shifting the hue of that grain a little bit. We could take a little bit of red out. And it just gives us a little bit more control over our grain. And if we look at the difference, we're starting to take a little bit of the colors out of it on the edge. So let's just see. You can also do a color correction on the grain slightly as well. I know that's kind of what we were talking about, why we avoid doing the despill, kind of why we do the denoise, the despill, and then re-adding the grain. But if there's a slight color mismatch in the grain, you could also go in there if you really want to be picky, and you could adjust the color. So, for example, if I'm seeing that's a little bit more purple, we could just like literally just do a color. I could invert this alpha so that the alpha looks like this. So we're targeting the outside edges. And then we could go and look at the grain. So I'm looking at the red, green, blue. And then we could just kind of push the colors in the way that we want if our grain is behaving a certain way that we don't want. And one thing we want to do is make sure we plug in this HueCorrect into here, just to make sure we're not applying that correction, over the rest of the original grain. So if we look at that and we take a look at the result of our grain check and we look at the edges, most of the edges are blending together pretty well and they have a pretty consistent level of grain. Again, this isn't a perfect grain profile for this plate, but in general, this is one way you can do your grains. And sometimes other people will do like a sort of a difference mat, basically taking like the original footage and the final comp and creating an alpha from that, and then kind of restoring some grain at the end of the script. So that's another way of doing it. And like I said, if you have Neat Video or something, sometimes you just add like a fake grain over the whole shot, and Neat Video does such a good job at restoring detail that you don't necessarily have to even worry about this edge process. But it will depend on the show and the person supervising in terms of the way they prefer it to be done. So yeah, that's pretty much it.